There seems to be this strange misconception in the podcasting industry that if your show just gets picked up by a network, your podcast is going to take off. And that is not exactly how podcast networks work. I have got Stephen Perlstein in the house with me, who is the Senior Vice President of Business Development over at Libsyn, where his job is to drive growth and monetization for many of today's top podcasts. So if you have ever wondered what the heck is a podcast network and how do they actually work, then listen closely, because Stephen is breaking down what a podcast network actually is, what it isn't, and what you should be looking for to find out if partnering with a network is a right fit for your show. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm so excited that you are here. I have been dying to have someone come talk podcast networks. I cannot even tell you, for years. And you wouldn't believe it, but it is hard to find the right person who brings just the perfect level of knowledge, the perfect level of humor, and the perfect level of just, let's have a conversation around this and break down what is a podcast network? Is it a fit for you? And I feel like you are the guy. So thanks for making the time to be here.
I'm so happy. You set me up with three perfects, a lot of high expectations, and I'm ready to deliver.
I'm going to be testing you. There'll be a pop quiz at the end. How well did you? No, I'm kidding. I'm totally kidding.
Yeah.
No, but I would love to just kick off there. Honestly, let's just define what is a podcast network. I feel like people have different ideas around what a podcast network actually is, and particularly in today's landscape. Can you just give us the lay of the land and kind of set up some context around what makes a podcast network for those listening right now?
For simplicity's sake, I tend to just think of a podcast network as a group of podcasters working together for the greater good of their podcast. I come from a pretty narrow, let's call it interest or background in podcasting. And so when I talk about a podcast network, or I think for this purpose of this conversation, we're talking about a business that is focused on monetizing podcasts and doing it at a scale. So as opposed to just selling ads on your show, a podcast network is focused on selling ads for a number of shows. Networks also have some other services that they often provide and have varying degrees of complexity, size, interest, niches, specialties, all kinds of things. But at its base level, a bunch of podcasters working together in the same direction and in a business setting, trying to sell ads for a bunch of podcasts.
And that's helpful context. You know, you go to these podcast conferences and you see the networks and you see the booths. And I feel like, I know just, from an independent podcaster standpoint, that could be really intimidating, because you're like, well, I don't know if I even have what it takes to be attractive to a network. Do I need to even be considering a network? And we're going to unpack all of that. But I'm curious, why do you think so many podcasters dream of being picked up by a network? For the average podcaster, what is the appeal there?
Well, I know that over the years, I've seen what's interesting about networks change over time. But one thing that always really strikes me is podcasting can be a very lonely endeavor. You don't typically have a great connection with your audience, and that's changed over the years with comments on Spotify and YouTube. But sometimes it can kind of feel like you're in the void. And that's something that I always really aspire to take care of with my creators that I work with, is not just faking a sense of community, but building that. And so a number of podcasts over the years that I've worked with have been like, I will join a network and that will mean hot tips for my podcast. That'll mean growth. That'll mean advertising. That'll mean, bigger audiences, new opportunities. So sometimes I think people can be a little bit vague about what it is that they specifically want out of a podcast network. And I think it's okay to have a podcast network that is very focused on the community aspect. I heard something once about, and I don't know if this is still a thing, a podcast network that was focused on pens, people who were like addicts of pens. And there's just a few people who did podcasts about pens and notebooks and whatever. I don't think it was a big financial endeavor, but it was just like a community of like-minded people. That is one very perfectly valid network, and what they're getting is community and resources and tips and maybe some guests and things. And then there's networks like Libsyn, where I work, that is very focused on monetizing and ad sales. And so we, I would say, are less strong on the how do we connect people over their passion for pens, and in fact, a lot stronger on how do we make sure podcasters are making money.
That's a really great distinction too, because I think that there's both types of networks. And like you said, some of them are more community forward. And if that is something that you are looking for, then that could be a really great fit where the monetization is not the main focus, but where the community is. On the flip side of that, some of them are very business forward, where that is what we're here to do. We're here to grow the podcast. We're here to monetize the podcast. We're all here to grow and make money together. And that's okay too. And I think that both of them have appeal. Have you seen any networks in which they do serve both ends, where maybe it is monetization focused, but also community?
I think it is possible for a network to be very, community focused, revenue focused, production support, marketing support. I've seen all of those things. I think the truth is very few, when you're trying to be everything for everyone, you end up being nothing for everyone, or something like that. And so I tend to think it's a really good idea to go into a conversation about a network or thinking that you're joining a network with a very clear eyed idea of what you're trying to get out of it. And at the same time, when you're talking to networks, very clear and direct questions that drive towards you getting or understanding what you will be getting out of it. I have dozens of conversations with creators every week who are considering joining the Libsyn Podcast Network. Previously, and I worked at Studio 71, the same. And I am the first to say when we cannot be helpful for a need that a podcaster has. I don't think all networks do that. In fact, I find that pretty frustrating when sometimes networks are obscuring or hiding what they do a little bit. But not everybody is right for everyone, and that's totally okay. It's like car shopping. Sometimes you want a Ferrari, sometimes you want a van. I'm in the van lifestyle right now. Shout out to my two cool kids, but maybe one day when I'm having my midlife crisis, I'm going to go for Ferrari. That's the same when you're shopping for a podcast network.
And I want to get into what those direct questions are, but I think let's talk first about what are some of the misconceptions that you see for these podcasters that you talk to that they have around what a network will do for them?
That's a good question. Everybody goes into understanding what a podcast network is a little bit different. And again, I think it's important to be really clear in what you want out of it. It's okay to match your needs and your wants to the network. One of the bigger misconceptions I think that comes in podcasting, because we come from, we're the child of radio, a broadcast medium. A lot of times I think people think of it as broadcast. Networks are broadcasters, and that we have an audience faucet. No network has an audience faucet that they can just turn on and give you tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of listeners. A couple of years ago, I had a conversation with a podcaster who was explaining to me simply all I needed to do was tap my resources and get them tens of thousands of listeners. And that was not a good fit. And I said directly, I was like, listen, if I could do that, I would, and I'd do it all day, and I'd make a ton of money, and it would be fantastic for everybody. But I can't. And anybody who tells you they can, or if you're believing that you can, that's a mismatch on what a network is. Some networks are okay at marketing, but in general, that's not what they do.
So what do they do? That's the big question. No, I'm teasing. I know. I mean, it depends, right? And what I'm hearing is you have to first understand what your needs are and then go out and look and shop networks and find the one that matches what those needs are. And those needs are going to be different for every podcaster. I'm curious though, what are some of the red flags that you would say or pitfalls that podcasters should avoid when it comes to courting a network, having those conversations, entertaining an offer from a network, and even some of those direct questions that they should be asking when they sit down to have that conversation?
Let's start with red flags. I don't think you should work with a podcast network that'll make vague promises. And I think when you're being spoken to directly or not, but it's something to watch out for. I don't like it when podcast networks have unclear reporting on downloads, on revenue. You should be able to know what's going on. You should also just be aware of demands of long exclusivity or ownership or perpetual licenses to your content. I think that is mostly dead in podcast networks now because everybody's pretty savvy. But every now and then I hear about things like that where a network is saying like, you'll be exclusive with us for 5 years and we own the content for 20 years. That's pretty ridiculous. Most network deals are anywhere from a year to 4 years, depending on kind of the network's commitment to it. If they overshare podcasters' information, if they tell you, hey, my podcaster X made $100,000 working with me, I might just be like, whoa, you're not being necessarily careful with your podcaster's data. Maybe that's approved. You should maybe wonder if they're going to share your data. Fees, if there are a lot of fees working with a podcast network in general, you shouldn't be paying too much, if anything, to join a podcast network. If they say they're helpful for everyone or they overpromise they can do a lot, they can do everything again. And it's always worth throwing into Google. There's a few well-known podcast networks that have had some issues over the years that I think it would be good not to get caught up into.
Yeah, Google's our friend there. Let's talk about the fees though, Stephen, because I feel like this is one that is kind of a unknown for a lot of people. Is there a fee typically to join a network? You mentioned they shouldn't be super high. Are there networks that are free to join, and are those worth joining if they're free? Can we unpack that a little bit, and kind of what should podcasters be thinking about when it comes to considering, is a network for me, what that fee structure would look like, or what expectations they should have around fees?
This is where my expertise might be narrow, and so I'll caveat that one. I am focused on commercial podcasts that make money through ad revenue and licensing deals and fan support and whatever. That is my sole focus. And so I can't speak to a network that maybe is very focused on like, hey, we've got some resources for you, podcast friend, and what those fees are. But I'd say in the commercial side of it, networks are deriving value, money, out of working with podcasters. And so uh, charging a fee can be a little bit of double dipping and kind of inappropriate. So if you work with Libsyn, we don't charge you a fee to work with us. There's no like, hey, onboard for $500 and then we'll start. That's not a thing. And I would be pretty skeptical of fees in general. The one thing that I would think is maybe appropriate for fees is hosting costs. Many networks will take on the distribution of your podcast and putting it up on their own hosting platform, like Libsyn or Megaphone or Simplecast, Art19, whatever it is. And there might be a small cost associated with that, but that should also be pretty transparent, calculable by you. You have a good sense of what it would cost and have a path to earning above that cost. So like if, we're charged, like, let's say somebody's like, it costs $100 a month to host your podcast with us or be on your network. You should have a pretty strong understanding that you will be able to make at least $101 relatively quickly on that. And if you can't, I would be a little concerned.
All very sound advice. And that's fair too. It's going to be a little bit different, but also to your point, especially on the commercial side, you're making money, and essentially the podcaster that you're working with becomes an asset to the network. And the idea is for you all to win. And so that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious. So when a podcast joins a network, and let's just you can speak to it from the commercial side. They join the network, and let's say it's a great fit. Everything is working. The network's happy. The podcaster's happy. What are some of those measurable outcomes that they could expect, and within what time frame?
So again, we're going to simplify it and say I'm talking about ad revenue, making money. You should know how much money you're making on your podcast before joining a network, and hopefully be able to find out pretty quickly how much you're making after joining a network. And so this is a very classic, like your mileage may vary type of situation, depending on your show, your niche, your size, all kinds of things. I would typically say I would expect some level of traction of seeing advertising revenue coming through, or at least advertisers and a clear path to like money is coming in 3 to 6 months. And if you're not seeing that, I would start to be a squeaky wheel, let's say, to my network. And it's totally okay for some networks, especially when shows are on the smaller side, to need a little more time than that. It's selling to brands a show is a process. It does take time, but you should have a sense of what's going on there. Hopefully, we are also monetizing via programmatic ads. That's pretty common. Libsyn has their auto ads product where we when we start working with podcasters, they're making money day one with us, guaranteed. It's not like, well, wait 6 months till we figure it out. Programmatic advertising is a smaller slice of the pie in general, and that's totally normal, but it's a nice little bridge. And if the network is promising you programmatic advertising, you should be seeing that pretty quick, like within a month.
Those are all great benchmarks to know. I mean, and you're right. It's different because it depends on the type of ads. It depends on a lot of things. But, to just have a simple frame of reference for how soon should I expect to be, if monetization is the goal, making money from this. And what is that trade-off and what does that look like? And if my dollars that I was making was zero, then anything above that should be a good thing, right? But if you are making some money from your podcast, then obviously you want there to be more in there as well. So all that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious if we were to zoom out for this a second before we get into the bonus episode, which I'm really excited to unpack, kind of like, okay, if you're curious about a network, how do you vet a deal, right? How are we kind of analyzing this at like the brass tacks level? And let's say you're ready to sign. Before you sign, what should you be thinking about? But before we get there, if we were to just kind of zoom out and look at, have networks changed over the past 5 to 10 years in the industry? And do you expect to see any trends with networks over the next, say, 5 to 10 years in the industry? Or is it one of those things that's pretty stable and it's going to be a bit dependent on the network, where it's like kind of depends on the purpose of the network and what purpose that serves for the creator?
Okay. Big question. How have podcast networks changed? A decade ago, a podcast network, I don't think, was an incredibly viable business model. There were some, they were okay. Now, the podcast network, if you can partner with the right network, with the right show, you can have a very lucrative career as a podcaster. I think that's going to continue. I see, no fear for the podcast network. The truth is, I work with hundreds of podcasters. I've seen hundreds, probably thousands of podcasters, analytics, revenue, whatever. I know a lot about it at this point. And so helping optimize or, push podcasters in the right direction with their content, I'm pretty good at. Maybe not for everybody, maybe not all the time, but I can generally get you in the right direction. And so can my many colleagues at Libsyn. We're pretty fantastic at what we do. I'm also a business professor at Cal State Fullerton, so I tend to think very businessy or like macroeconomic-y or microeconomic-y. We come from broadcast, we come from radio. The thing about radio was it was a value add right out of the gate. Radio was, we have audiences. We have a captive audience. We have a little monopoly on our little antenna in that area. We have put cost into it, to build that antenna. Like there's a very clear value add. Now, networks are a service business. And a service business is very cheap to run. And the barrier to entry is basically zero. If I want to start a radio network, I need to build a radio tower, and that costs money. If I want to start a podcast network, I need to get a little hosting account, and I could set up Spotify for podcasters for free if I wanted to. And so the one thing I would caution, or I do see a lot of, is people starting podcast networks, services, without the expertise or the value for creators. I think there's some good, strong, pointed questions you'd want to ask any partner in podcasting, any service provider. What are you really doing? What's the real value add in working with you, especially if they are talking about taking some type of revenue, ownership, rights to your content?
Yes, all good questions. This is interesting to kind of see how it's evolved and that it's stable. It's not going anywhere. And then it sounds like, honestly, Stephen, from what you're describing, that there are a lot of opportunities with networks because there's no one size fits all. And that's kind of the beauty of it. But this has been really enlightening and really insightful. I'm excited to dig into some of the brass tacks with you in the bonus episode. So thanks for being here and thanks for all the wisdom that you've shared with us.
Can't wait.
So if you've ever wondered if joining a podcast network is right for you, well, come with us to the next episode before you sign the dotted line, because Stephen is joining us back to break down what most podcasters miss when it comes to network deals, including how to spot hidden red flags, how to understand common deal structures, and the exact questions you should be asking the network before partnering with them so you can make smart decisions that protect your creative and financial future. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.